Okay, let's now talk about relationships between our different entities and how Entity Framework deals with this. Now, I've mentioned before, Entity Framework is convention-based. And what we have here is we have an app user entity, and inside our app user entity is a list of photos. Our photo is an entity. Now, Entity Framework is automatically going to recognize this as a relationship between our app user and our photos. And in database terminology, one user can have many photos, so this is a one-to-many relationship. Now, Entity Framework is going to recognize this. And by convention, it's going to create a table for the photos as well. Even if we do nothing else and we create a new migration, if we go and take a look at our data context, then currently what we have is a single DB set for our users. Now, we know that we're going to store our photos in its own table. Does that mean we need to add a DB set? Well, not necessarily. We can do, but it's not required because we add a DB set when we want to query that entity. Now, the photos is going to be a relation to our users. And also these are referred to as navigation properties. So we could say that the photos is a navigation property inside our app user class. So inside the data context, then we have a navigation property from our app user to the photos. So we can access our photos by querying users.photos. It's a navigation. And we may want to add the photos as a DB set inside here, but it really depends on how we want to make the queries. Do we need to query the photo entity directly? Is there going to be a point where we need to get a specific photo based on its ID? And for our application, I'm going to say no. So that means we don't need to create a DB set, and we can leave it to Entity Framework conventions to create the appropriate table. Now, I also mentioned that by convention, when we create a DB set, it uses the name of what we provide here as the name for the table. So it creates a users table. But if we don't specify a DB set, then what does it use as the name? Well, it just uses the name of the entity. And I like tables to be pluralized in the database. And I don't really want a table just called photo, I want it to be called photos. So when conventions doesn't work for us, we could use attributes or annotations to tell Entity Framework what we want. So in this case, if I want a table name called photos, then I can specify in square brackets at the top, I can use table, which I get from System Component Model Data Annotations, and then I can specify what I want the name of the table to be, and in this case I want it to be called photos. So let's create a new migration and just see what happens. We can always remove migrations after we have created them. So let's open up our terminal and let's go to the .NET, and we're going to want to stop our application at this time anyway, so please do stop it. And let's use the .NET EF migrations add command. And I'm going to say update or updated user entity. And we don't need to specify an output directory if we already have a migration. So I can just press return here. And so long as we've got everything configured correctly, this should work. And sure enough, it has. If you did get an error at this point, and your migration did not succeed because it says build failed, then at this point you would want to execute .NET Build and press return, because this will tell you what errors you have in your application that you can then go and take a look at and resolve, and then come back and then run the migration command again. Because if this does fail, I don't think it tells you where you've got problems in your code, and one way to get the information about what problems you have in your code is just to try and build your application. But I don't need to do that because this one did work. So let's go to our migrations folder in the data folder and migrations and take a look at what we have created. So in the updated user entity migration, in the up method, we're adding some columns. That's to be expected: the city, the country, the created, the date of birth, gender, interest, introduction, and the ones that are not required, where we made them optional, then nullable is true. And otherwise, where we've got required strings, then nullable is false. And we'll keep going down until we get to our photos table. What's going to happen inside here? Well, conventions have taken place again, but we got the name from the table attribute we added. We've got our ID column with the auto increments, and that's going to be used as our primary key. And then we've got the URL is main public ID, but we've also got this app user ID. And by convention, Entity Framework has recognized that this is a relation with our app user, so we have an app user ID column. We didn't specify that in our photo entity. But one thing that's not great about this is nullable is true. We certainly didn't ask for that. Or did we? Well, conventionally we did, because we didn't tell Entity Framework otherwise. So this migration isn't going to work for us, because this means that we can have a photo in our database that is not associated with a user. Also, this means that we can delete a user from our database, and it's not going to enforce that a photo associated with that user also gets deleted. So we want nullable to be false for our app user ID here. So how do we do that? Well, let's take a brief detour to the Entity Framework documentation and relationships. And we have our different types of relationships on the left-hand side, the one-to-many, the one-to-one, the many-to-many. And if we take a look at the one-to-many, then we have a required one-to-many type and an optional one-to-many type, and then a required with shadow foreign key and an optional one-to-many with shadow foreign key. We're going to focus on the required one-to-many and optional one-to-many, because currently we have an optional one-to-many. But if we want a required one-to-many, then if we take a look at their example here, we have a blog, and a blog has a collection of posts. And then in the related entity, we specify these two fields in the related entity. In this case, because it's about a blog, we need the required foreign key property. In this case, it's the blog ID. And conventionally, this has to be the name of the class followed by its ID. So blog ID in this case. And then we also need the required reference navigation to the principal. So in this case, it's blog. But also, because this example is using the nullable reference types, and I think this is one of the reasons why I wanted to come to this documentation, is because we can't make this required here, otherwise Entity Framework will throw an exception. And we also can't initialize it with anything either. It does need to be null, but also required, and we have to use the null forgiving operator here, and the null forgiving operator is an exclamation mark. So we set it to be null, and we give it that exclamation mark. That's how we achieve this using conventions with Entity Framework. So let's go back and configure that, but we've got a migration that does not suit our needs. So we need to remove this migration. So we'll open up the terminal, and I'm going to say .NET EF migrations remove. And because we have not applied this to our database, then this should be no problem, and it should go ahead and remove this migration. And sure enough, it has. And in the tab at the top, we can see this is no longer available. Okay, so in order to make this a required one-to-many, inside our photo entity, we need to provide the navigation properties. So I'm just going to say, as a comment, navigation properties. And we're going to say prop and an int, and we need the app user ID. And we also need to specify the app user and call it app user. And because we get the warning here, we have to follow the guidance and set this to be null. But in order not to get a compiler warning here, we need to use the null forgiving operator of the exclamation mark there as well. So that's how we set up a required one-to-many relationship. So let's recreate or rerun the command to create a new migration. And I'll just repeat the command I had before, the migrations add updated user entity. And we'll let it do its thing, and then we'll take a look at the created migration class. So now that's been created, let's go take a look. And if we take a look inside the migrations folder and take a look at our new migration, and we scroll on down to the photo table creation, what we have now is roughly the same thing. But this time, if we take a look at nullable, then this is now set to false for our app user ID. And what we also have inside here in the constraints is we have the onDelete behavior, in this case referential action cascade. What this means, if we delete an app user, then any associated photos or related photos with that user also get deleted. So now we've got a new migration. We're going to hold off applying this to our database because there's a better way of applying this stuff to our database and updating our database in code. And that's the approach we're going to take a look at. But first of all, we need to get hold of some data that we can seed into our database, and we'll take a look at approaches to doing that next.